Module 12. Today we're talking about the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the basic structure of the cortex. So our cerebral cortex is what we typically think of when we think of our brain. And the cortex has two sides. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And these hemispheres are filled with axons that basically connect the cortex to the brain's other regions, like the ones we've talked about in our previous modules. So the limbic system and the older brain structures. Now, our cerebral cortex is a thin layer which contains about 20 to 23 billion neurons and 300 trillion synaptic connections. And our cerebral cortex has four parts. These parts are called lobes, and the lobes are as follows. So we've got our frontal lobe. That's in the front. So right here is our frontal lobe. It's at the front of our skull. And this area is involved in speaking, muscle movements, making plans, and making judgments. So it has a lot of different roles, but those are its main ones. Behind the frontal lobe, kind of on the top, like middle, is called the parietal lobe. And this is the area of the brain which receives sensory information for touch and body positioning. So when you touch something, when you feel something with your skin, that information is going to go to the parietal lobe right here, where it's going to be processed. Then in the back, at the base of your skull, is where our occipital lobe is. And this area receives visual stimuli and basically will transmit that information for us to be able to see. And then on the sides of our head, right above our ears, is what we call the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe has areas that process hearing, which makes sense why they would be near the ear. And they also do other functions, but big area is for hearing processing. Also, like music is processed in there. The temporal lobe is also a spot where we have facial recognition mechanisms. Okay, so in the cortex, specifically in the frontal lobe, so again right here, towards the back of the frontal lobe, there's this area called the motor cortex. And this strip of cerebral cortex matter is basically the area that controls our voluntary movement. So me talking with my hands right now, that is being directed by the neurons in the motor cortex. And this was originally discovered in 1870 by two researchers, Fritsch and Hitzig, which stimulated a animal's frontal cortex. And they found that when they stimulated it, it made parts of the body move. And so the motor cortex sits at the rear of the frontal lobe, and it controls voluntary movements. Now, something that's funky about our brain is that when we do things with our body, it's controlled by the opposite side of the brain. So, for example, if I wave at you with my right hand, my left motor cortex is the one that's directing it to do that. Now, interestingly, in the motor cortex, researchers have found that areas that require more fine motor control, for example, your hands, your fingers, like to write, for example, those areas in the motor cortex have a greater amount of space that they take up than areas that require less control, like a leg's muscle. So the small muscles here require more precision, so they have a greater surface area in the motor cortex than ones that require less precision. Now, really cool, researchers today have been able to allow humans to control a robot arm or wheelchair with just their brain signals. Basically, they attach an electrode in the motor cortex and then attach that through electrical signals to a robotic arm. And so a person can think, I'm going to raise my arm. And if they're paralyzed and they don't have that ability, it can cause the robotic arm to do the action that they want to just by thinking it. Really, really cool scientific research and application. Okay, then we have functions of the cortex, the sensory functions. I'm gonna move that a little bit. Now, so we've got our motor cortex at the back of the frontal lobe. Right behind that is what we call the somatosensory cortex. And this area sits at the top of the parietal lobe. And basically, this is the area that receives touch information from the skin, such as temperature, pressure, and movement of body parts. And we call this the somatosensory cortex. And similar to the motor cortex, for the somatosensory, the more sensitive that area is, the larger amount of cortex is given. So, for example, if you see here, this is our somatosensory cortex. The lips has a very large area given to it because the lips are very sensitive part of our body. Whereas, something like the nose does not have as much sensory given because it's not as sensitive to touch. So the somatosensory cortex is for touch sensation. For vision, like we talked about, the visual cortex lies in the back of our brain in the occipital lobe. Now, our occipital lobe is pretty large, given that humans are very visual creatures. There are other animals that have larger auditory cortexes, and so they have better hearing. Interestingly, there was a study done where people were given LSD and they did fMRI scans on their brains. And what they found was that actually, for those on LSD compared to those in the placebo condition, the people on LSD, their occipital lobe was lit up and it was communicating to a bunch of the other lobes. So it seemed more real than for the people taking the placebo. So occipital lobe and the visual cortex is where visual stimuli is processed. And then lastly, hearing is processed in the auditory cortex of your temporal lobe. So again, temporal lobe is right above the ears, and hearing is processed there. Also, interestingly, people who suffer from schizophrenia, when they've done brain scans on them, they have found that actually there's activation of the temporal lobe happening that's not happening in people without schizophrenia. So they are, in fact, having the experience of hearing things, even when there aren't things there. All right. Now, beyond motor areas and sensory areas, there are also association areas, which most of the brain is what is an association area. So, association areas, when they are stimulated, when like they probe them or poke them with an electrode, they actually don't trigger any observable responses because their job is to do things that are more complex, like learning, remembering, thinking, speaking. So some association areas that we've been able to point out have been the Broca's region. Now, the Broca's region is in our left frontal lobe, and we have found that this area allows people to speak fluently. So the fact that I'm able to put together a sentence coherently is due to the Broca's region in part. Now, let's say I had damage to my Broca's region. That would be called Broca's aphasia. And that would result in me not being able to communicate clearly in the sense that my speech might be broken. My sentences might not be complete or coherent. Behind that, in the left temporal lobe, is Wernicke's area. And this region basically allows us to comprehend what's being said and what we're saying. So the Broca's region is about speech production. This region is about speech comprehension. Then our prefrontal cortex, this is the area at the very tippy top of the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex is really important. And this is the area that takes the longest to develop in humans, which is why researchers suggest, not allowing people to make big decisions before 25 because the prefrontal cortex is developing still until 25. And that area of the brain is responsible for doing things like judgment, making decisions, planning, processing new memories. It kind of can moderate one's emotions. It can help you with making moral decisions. And so, for example, if a person had damage to their prefrontal cortex, they might still score high on IQ tests, but if asked to bake a cake, they would not be able to plan out how to do that and carry that action out. Um, Also, damage to the frontal lobe can lead to a loss of inhibition. So you might just say or do whatever without kind of thoughts of how that could have consequences. And there can also be changes in emotional control. Also, there can be poor decision making if your prefrontal cortex is damaged. So, for example, there was a man named Cecil Clayton who had an accident where 20% of his prefrontal cortex was lost. And this led to increased impulsivity in him, and it actually led to him killing someone. So, yeah, the prefrontal cortex is for those bigger decision making skills, planning, thinking about consequences, all of that. Okay, now in the parietal lobe, remember that's right here. Our frontal lobes are here, our parietal lobes right here. In our parietal lobe, there are also areas that are responsible for mathematical and spatial reasoning, as well as the perception of movement. So, for example, big brain Albert Einstein, in fact, didn't have a big brain overall, but his parietal lobe was very large in comparison to other people's brains. In our temporal lobe, there is an area called the fusiform face area, like I mentioned earlier, which allows us to recognize faces. And there are people who we've studied in case studies that have had damage to these areas. And what we find is they cannot recognize their mom or dad or sister anymore after having damage to this region. Now, overall, though, I want to make the point that today, you know, brain scans are allowing us to learn a lot more about the brain and different functions, but we're not just trying to do phrenology 2.0. That's not the goal, and that's not the message that's being sent to us through these scans. The message is that overall, there are vast neural networks where lots of things are being processed in lots of different areas. So, for example, speech production is not only processed in the left temporal lobe or left frontal lobe, it's processed throughout the whole brain in different areas. And so it's not just one specific spot that controls one specific thing. Many spots control many things. And so it's just not as clear cut as that. Now, lastly, plasticity. Our brain basically is really amazing at adapting and repairing itself when there is damage done. And we call this ability to change and reorganize and rebuild plasticity. Now, plasticity is greatest during one's childhood when we're young. That's why they always suggest, like, oh, you should really try to, if you want to learn a new language, it's best to do that as a child because your brain is a lot more flexible as a child than it is as an adult. Doesn't mean it can't do it. It's just a lot easier then to do it. So plasticity basically means that as you use your brain changes. So for example, piano players who have a lot of practice in that actually have larger auditory cortexes in order to hear what they're playing. And so from the practice of playing piano, their brain has changed in response to that behavior. People who have really good coordination, they probably will have slightly different motor cortexes. Maybe they have greater area there. Another amazing thing about plasticity is that not only responding to how we behave or what we practice, what we give time to and experience to, our brain can also respond to damage, and it will make use of all of it as well as it can. So, for example, I had a choir teacher in junior high named Mr. McAlexander, and as a child, he suffered from cancer in his brain, which left him blind. Now, did his occipital lobe just go to waste? No. Plasticity has shown us that what the brain will do is actually other areas that aren't being used will be taken over by those that are being used. So Mr. McAlexander, my choir teacher, had like the most amazing hearing ever because his auditory cortex had taken over areas that were used for the visual stuff that wasn't being used. And so he had like supersonic hearing. It was really crazy, and also really intense smell. That's why people who are blind or deaf often have heightened senses, like hearing or vision, vice versa, depending upon the person's disability, because the brain is able to adapt and use every resource that it can. Also, the brain will attempt to repair itself by reorganizing existing tissue and mend itself through neurogenesis, the production of new neurons. So, interestingly, researchers have found that just the hippocampus alone makes like billions of neurons every year, new neurons. So, no, not all of your brain cells are dying. There are new ones. All right. And now you got to test yourself. See you soon.